Hello, Spark fans. Welcome back to Advancing Spark. Once again, it's been ages since I made a video, and we've got loads to talk about. So, we're going to talk Databricks news. We're going to have a look at their platform and say what has changed in the past couple of months. Now, didn't manage to get a February one done, so we're going to cover February 2024, March 2024, and talk about all the things that have gone in, and whoa, we've got a lot of stuff to talk about. So, yeah. That's the plan. We're going to grab the release notes, have a step through. I'll pull out the things I think are important to us, that we should care about, and the things that you might have missed. The plan, as always, if you're new around here, don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, Advancing Spark is brought to you by Advancing Analytics, your friendly neighborhood data and AI consultancy who help lots of people do lots of things like this. What we do. Cool. So, let's go and have a look at what's actually in the news. As always, I've got the Azure flavor of the release notes up. Do use the ones for your cloud provider. Make sure it's relevant for you. And I'm going to dive right to the bottom so we can kind of step up. So we'll do February, we'll have a step through. We'll do March, we'll have a step through. And we'll see what's going on. So let's begin. First things first, Delta sharing didn't used to allow you to use certain features. Essentially, the Delta read version had to be below a certain version. That's now enabled. So if you're using deletion vectors, and deletion vectors is that little bit of metadata. That means Delta doesn't have to copy over all of the rows that didn't change when all you've done is just deleted a record. It used to have to do that with Parquet. Deletion vectors, it'll now create a little bit of metadata. And then you don't need to recreate your file. You don't need to copy any data. It's much more efficient. Didn't used to be able to support that with Delta sharing. It now does. Makes sense. It's all good. It's better. There's a new runtime. We'll have a look at that in a minute. There's an even newer runtime, which we'll also have a look so we can get a good idea of everything that's in there. Create tables from files in volumes. So previously it used to be if you had a volume, that just had to be unstructured data. And then if you want to turn it into a table, you need to bring the data over and move it somewhere else. You can now, through the UI, point at some files and go, actually, you can just register that as a managed Unity catalog table. So some purposes, some uses, makes sense. Nice. Databricks Connect. That's our way of being able to use a local IDE to develop and actually go and connect to a remote Databricks cluster. That's now GA for Scala. So it was GA for other bits of business, now GA for Scala. Yes, you can now do SQL and DBT file tasks. So essentially, if you have SQL files stored just as files and you want to create a job to run that SQL file or run that DBT file, you can now do that. It used to just be ones that were in Git. Whereas now you can do a bit of both. It can just be stored in your workspace. And there's some changes to how we think about Git and workspace and folders and things. We'll be talking about those in a little bit. They've changed how the Databricks Git server works. It doesn't need full permissions to be able to do things, which makes a lot of sense. And you can now use the Databricks Git server proxy. So essentially, if you had an on-prem Git server and you're trying to get Databricks to connect to it, it was a bit awkward. And now you can connect to it securely from Databricks repos or Git folders. And now we actually do it nicely and securely. You can find machine learning models in UnityCat using a global workspace search. There's been a few improvements that we'll see around that workspace search. So if you're in Databricks and you've got the search bar at the top, that search bar is getting better and better and better as they add more things like the AI-powered search into it, more of the Lakehouse IQ things. So again, you can now find machine learning models. So if you're there going, right, what have I got? And you search for something, kind of churn, you'd get maybe a load of data sets that were to do with churn. You would also get the models from UnityCat that are actually doing that inference. That is now something that works via the search, which is cool. File arrival triggers in Azure Databricks is now GA, which I forgot it wasn't even GA. It's been around for so long. Essentially, it's doing a file arrival trigger. So essentially, if you've got something like blob storage or you've got kind of an area of the lake and you've mapped that, you can have a workflow kickoff as soon as that file arrives. So now if you've got a Unity catalog volume, and you can have that doing the same thing. So if you've got a volume, a new file arrives in that volume, you can say, oh, there's a new file, kick off a new job to go and process that file. You don't have to be running jobs every hour, every 15 minutes on a regular cadence to go, anything come in? No. Anything come in? No. Anything? No. Now you can just say, just run whenever a file comes in, and it'll just get processed and go through immediately. It doesn't always work for the kind of things where we have a massive dependency graph and there's 100 different tables and we need to process them all together and map them together. Individual file arrivals probably wouldn't work for those scenarios. But where you've got like an individual file, you need to update a reference table, great, nice, quick way of getting that stuff to go through just as soon as that file arrives. We can now run SQL notebook jobs on a SQL warehouse. So if you have a SQL notebook, you can attach that rather than to a straightforward, interactive cluster, rather than a normal Databricks Spark cluster. You can attach a notebook now to a SQL warehouse. Still a Spark cluster under the hood, but the big thing is we can make that serverless. So you can now be running, if you've got some SQL just stored in a notebook, hook it up to a serverless SQL warehouse, hit go, and it'll start in a couple of seconds and run, and then you can turn it off nice and quick. So if you're doing a load of SQL work, or if a lot of your logic is stored as SQL, that's going to save you a lot of time and effort, and you're going to save so much time waiting for clusters to turn on. So that is a big change. If you have other languages in that notebook, so if you have a SQL notebook and it has Python cells, and you run that on that SQL warehouse, it's just going to ignore your Python cells. So generally think about it, it is just SQL workloads that you've got that's going to go and be doing that. More changes back to the AI search. It's now leveraging a Lakehouse IQ, or now renamed to be Databricks IQ. Essentially, it's the data intelligence engine, aka a giant large language model that sits in the background that actually gives a much more sensible search experience. So it can do things like semantics. It can do things like based on popularity. If you ask it something and you've got two tables, one is never used and one is constantly used, it's going to give a bias to the ones that are actually used. It has some intelligence in terms of how it answers your search queries. If you use natural language, it'll try and figure it out. You can give it a lot more hints. Basically, the search is a lot more powerful than it used to be. So if you have a Databricks workspace and there's just loads and loads of things stored in Unity Cat and you're trying to figure out what to work with, that's going to save you a huge amount of time. So yeah, it's generally good. Unity Catalog volumes are now GA. Good. We use that's now the entry point for almost all data into Databricks in terms of the way AA build things. It's just how files from various different other third-party systems and source systems land into a volume, and then that's where it all triggers through and flows through into your Delta tables in the rest of your lake, into your, I don't know, bronze, silver, gold, if you like that medallion stuff. We can now use a SQL function. Did a video about that recently, which essentially you can just write a SQL function, and behind the scenes that's going off and it's pinging essentially a web service to a publicly hosted large language model such as ChatGPT, such as Mistral and Llama and all the other ones. That is now baked in just as SQL functions, which are very cool. The add data UI, if you ever go into Databricks and click add data and then just give it a file, you can now do XML. Yeah. Cool. So we've got Cloudflare R2 storage. So there's always been this like slightly awkward thing with all of the cloud providers where if you put a load of data into that cloud and then you want to pull it out and put it somewhere else, you get charged for a thing called egress. Anytime data leaves the region where you have put that data, you get charged a little bit of bandwidth for pulling data out. So if you had something in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, and then you put it into Delta sharing, and it was really popular, and people were just constantly pulling that data out, you're going to get charged actually a fair chunk of money for your data egress costs. The other thing is also, it's quite hard to do that with networking. It's going to be behind a VNet. How do people have access to that thing? So what we've now got is the ability to use Cloudflare. They've got their own R2 storage there, and you can actually export data into that Cloudflare storage and actually expose your Delta sharing from there. So you wouldn't use it as your full lake. You wouldn't have it as that's where your whole enterprise data lake medallion architecture lives. But if you're exporting data to put it into Delta sharing to get it to other people, you can now use that R2 kind of Cloudflare storage basically as your DMZ, your demilitarized zone, your place you can put stuff to share it, and then it goes out from there, which is very cool. Okay, what else can we do? You've got this new enhanced security and compliance features, and there's a few things in this, as well as the HPIA kind of compliance. There's a bunch of extra compliance features that they've enabled fairly recently inside Databricks that we can now have a look at, which is cool. Again, probably our entire separate video its own going through a lot of the new security features. It's one of those interesting ones. You can now enable automatic cluster updates. So if you're worried that, you've seen all the latest new versions, you've been on an LTS version of an Azure Databricks runtime, like, I need it to just update, and you just want it to happen automatically. You can now do that. You can tell the cluster, actually, on this cadence, in this maintenance window, update to the latest Databricks runtime, which is pretty cool. can go do that. Databricks Managed Service Principals is a new way of connecting things, especially so if you're in Azure and you want it to, rather than have to go into enter ID and create a service principal through there, you can now create it directly through Databricks, and that will actually go and essentially create a single serving one for you. Again, just a slightly more, you need less access. You don't need full access to enter ID to be able to do that stuff. It still needs permissions to be able to do things. You've got some more controls about how you work in workspaces for what you need to be able to do. So essentially, rather than just being able to pick any other person as a job owner, you can now only set it to yourself. Or, you can set it so that people can only set it to themselves. Just some more useful things in terms of managing workflows. Some better things in terms of how we manage private link connections. So we actually have that kind of go and connect out properly. Essentially, in the audit logs, you'll now get an idea about what the source IP addresses are. So that'll just be a little bit better. And finally, you can now use DLT as long as that table has a primary key to be a feature table. So we've had it in Unity Catalog. You can take the existing Delta table and then go make this a feature table, and it will label all of the feature store APIs. So then a data scientist can go and then use that as part of AutoML. They can use that as part of their own kind of model training. They can use it as part of inference. Lots of stuff they can do there. You didn't used to be able to do that if it was a Delta Live table and the way it was kind of done. Now you can. So pretty cool. In preview, lots of things you can do there. So yeah, loads of things going on in February. If we have a quick dive over to the runtime that came out in February, we've got this 14.3 LTS, whole bunch of stuff that went as part of that. So number one, fair biggie actually. We saw some changes to deletion vectors, particularly to do with Delta sharing, but you've got support for deletion vectors in a merge without using Photon. So it used to be if you're using Photon, it would be able to use deletion vectors, but otherwise you wouldn't be able to get it. So you do a merge, and then it would just delete things the old way, meaning I'd have 10 million rows in a Parquet file. I delete one record. I have to copy 9.9999 million rows into a new Parquet file. That's how Parquet does deletions in a Delta table without deletion vectors. So again, if you just upgrade and you're using 14.3 and you've got a load of merges, you'll suddenly find they all go a hell of a lot faster if you've enabled deletion vectors and all that stuff. So pretty cool. You can use the catalog APIs, so you can at least with better libraries of going through and connecting to that stuff. Delta Uniform is now GA. So Delta Uniform we heard about in Summit last year. And that was this whole idea of I could take a Delta table and I say, can you please just also make the iceberg metadata? So if someone tries to query it, they can treat it as an iceberg table, treat it as a Hoodie table. You can try to make it so a Delta table can appear as any of the other storage, and it just is a common compatible querying layer. So Delta Uniform is now GA for making iceberg tables inside of Delta, as long as you're using 14.3. It's cool. A bunch of things to do with SQL parameters. So we've got execute immediate if you're trying to do a parameterized SQL query. We've also got something a little bit later in here to do with variables. So I can have temporary variables I create in a SQL session and pass that in to parameterize a query. That all comes together, probably worth another video on its own. So many things. We can now also recompute statistics if you've changed things around for data skipping. For example, if I was only collecting the first 32 stats, I was only collecting statistics for the first 32 columns of a Delta table, and I went, you know what, actually, there's 100 columns in here, and the stats are going bad. We can now change that parameter, and we can tell it to recompute, so go back and recollect all the stats for the existing transaction log. Pretty cool. And query state information. That's a really interesting one. If we're streaming, we've got state information that's held within the checkpoint folder. So that has an idea of each micro batch basically keeps an asynchronous log of where the state of that structured streaming query. Really hard to actually go and look at that metadata. And there's a few now kind of just essentially we can query it as another data source and say, I want to go into my my structured streaming state log and just pull that back and have a look about the state of various streams that were going on. Super, super interesting if you're doing a lot of very heavy, a lot of state-based structured streaming. So, cool. We can do some better things in terms of Kafka authentication with Enter ID, which is good. Island partition pruning should now go faster. So depending on the type of join you were doing, the null tolerant equality joins should go faster because it's using a different thing inside the Catalyst engine. So good. Hopefully we'll see a real uplift of that. Talk about variables. They've removed some things in terms of the thrift server. Honestly, never use it. If that's something you care about, great. And then finally some stuff to do with authenticating with Confluence schema registry. So you can go and do. And then this thing, you can now talk to XML. Really, really important. In the past, we've built for clients things where they had XML coming in and we had to convert it over into JSON so that we can use all the Spark native stuff. This will help with a huge amount of things, actually being able to just treat XML in exactly the same way as we treat JSON in autoloader, doing kind of schema evolution stuff, being able to do the native querying of XML stored as a string. There are loads of scenarios when it comes up. It's just, could we just stop using XML, please? Please. But still, it's good that it's there. I just hate that it has to be there. Cloud Flash storage, again, with the ability to use that with Delta sharing, we need to be able to use it with our Spark clusters. We can now use that as a storage location. You can now go and work with workspace files, which makes sense. Again, you can now use init scripts and cluster libraries in shared access clusters. So it was unable to do that before. So some general improvements, some things that kind of work around some things that were problems. XML Support is a huge one, as much as I'm cynical about it. And again, I know so many people who will be so happy with the parameterized SQL and the table variable, the temporary variables and the things that go into that. There's just a huge amount of useful stuff in there. So yeah, should go a bit faster. You can do more stuff with it. SQL people will be happy. And XML is now a thing again. Cool. Right, so that brings you up to date at the end of February. Now we've got a whole extra month to go and do it again. So what happened in March? Well, predictive optimization is available in more places. If you haven't seen much about predictive optimization, that's essentially saying there's a bunch of managed tables. Has to be managed tables currently, has to be in Unity Catalog. And it will go and look at those tables regularly, bit of configuration there, and go, oh, well, you need to optimize that and you need to vacuum that. And it will go and perform those maintenance jobs for you. So predictive optimization is essentially automatic maintenance of Delta tables that have been stored as managed tables inside Unity. Couple of limitations. It won't Z order things for you as part of the optimize. So if you have Z ordering and you've been tuning your tables, that won't work with predictive optimization. And it doesn't work with liquid clustering yet. So if you've got big, chunky tables, you need to do the management of it yourself. You need to set all the good performance tuning settings yourself. If you've got a load of tables that you're like, it just needs to be optimized and vacuumed, that will do that for you if you turn on predictive optimization. You need to turn it on. You can turn it on at the schema level, at the table level. It's now available in small regions. Feature serving is GA. Feature serving is that essentially it's a real-time table lookup. So if you wanted to do real-time inference and say, right, go get the value for this, rather than trying to use a Delta table and the whole Spark thing, the parallels and thing, it is just a real low latency object store. And that is hosted on the Databricks side using serverless and all that kind of stuff. Very good for things like retrieval augmented generation. So if you're trying to pass some data, just go get some chunked embeddings and things, like you more use vector search for that. Go get some information we can pass into the prompt on the root. You would use things like feature serving for that. So super useful. Some changes to how they use syspath, especially if you're in repos, sure. Some support ending for runtimes, cool. The new runtime we've got, Databricks runtime 15.0. We'll have a look at that in a moment. So a region limit for private endpoints. So you can only go up to 100 private endpoints, which previously was 10. So you had limitations of how networked you can get things to be. Now it's a lot better, which is good. Delegate authority to view an object's metadata in Unity. So you've got a browse privilege, which is great. If you want people to be able to just go and have a look around Unity, have a look at the various different stats, look at the details of things, but without actually automatically giving them select on it, great. Because previously it was either you could see it or you couldn't see it. Whereas if you want people to know it's there and be able to have a look what's in there, and then if they're like, oh, actually I want that, I need to go and request access to be able to actually read it, it's at least people can see it. So you've got this browse, allow people to go and see what data they have, even if they don't have access to it. Super important for data discovery. Data discovery doesn't work if people can't see what they don't have access to, because then they don't know that it's there. They can't request access to it because they don't know it's there. So yeah, super interesting. Again, SQL Warehouses for notebooks is GA. So you now go and do that stuff. A couple of things with HIPAA compliance. Again, that's if you're building a heavily secure thing that now supports serverless. Previously, you couldn't go and run those workloads on serverless compute. It wouldn't be compliant. That is now compliant. So if you're in a very kind of tied down thing, there's a whole bunch of features you can go and have a look at there. You can now grant temporary access for Databricks people to have a look at your workspace. So previously, if you raised a support request and said, hey, this notebook's not just working, it's just erroring, they would go, great, we can't see it. Do you want to share your screen? Whereas now you can kind of just grant a temporary access token and go, okay, we'll allow your support into our workspace. They can go and have a look at things, debug things, check the logs, and then remove access from them. So just a nicer, slicker way of getting support if you're talking to Databricks for support. Again, you can now manage private endpoints from the Databricks account console rather than having to do it as an entirely separate thing. Interesting, useful. I've not had to play with that yet. New ADBC driver, if you're connecting to it separately, cool. Does various things. They've extended support for some of the older runtimes. Again, probably people who didn't want to move on to the S1 just yet. This is a big change. Databricks repos changed to Git folders. So previously, if you're using Git integration, a long time ago, you did that on a notebook by notebook basis. Then they brought out Databricks repos, and it lived as a whole separate section. And then they brought it into the workspace. So you go into Databricks, you look at the workspace, you see here's my workspace and all folders and things, and then here are my Databricks repos, and you see the various different repos that you'd connected up. They've changed how that works. They're folding that into the whole workspace. So if you look in your workspace, you'll see a whole mix of folders. Some of them are going to be essentially Git-backed repos. Some of them are going to be workspace folders. They now can be all the same thing. You can have a mix and match. You can have a subfolder that has some files in there and then also has a Git repo in there. You don't have to think, right, I'm going over to something source controlled, it's over there. I'm going over, not source controlled, it lives over there. It's now all together and you can just create folders that are Git folders. So a big change in that you'll have to look in a different place. Otherwise, they're going to kind of work the same way. I do like the, what happened to Databricks repos? That's a question we can go and ask and see what's actually going on over there. The new runtime's GA. Again, we'll have a look at that in a moment. You can now sign up for Databricks Marketplace if you're doing private exchange listings. So essentially, if you wanted things to just appear to literally everybody in there, you have to go through a Databricks partner provider sign up. You have to be vetted. You have to go through a process with Databricks. If you just want to do a private exchange listing, so essentially using the marketplace as a mechanism getting your data to someone else, you can now just sign yourself up and go through a process of getting that started. Again, probably a whole extra video of me grabbing some data and putting it through that process so you see how that works. Massive, massive thing. Interactive notebook debugging. The biggest thing people have had a problem with about switching to things like Databricks is if they try and write some code in a notebook, in the cloud, through the browser, they can't step through that code. And people have built so many things trying to get it to work really, really nicely in VS Code. The guys have done a huge amount of work in terms of Spark Connect and Databricks Connect so that you can open VS Code, you can connect it to a Databricks cluster, and you can start coding purely because people wanted to step through the code and debug it, do interactive debugging. You can now do that inside a notebook in the browser. So you can write a big old cell, you can write as much code as you want in a cell, and then step through it and look at the variable explorer and look at how things change and interactively debug that code. That is a massive, massive, massive change for how people are going to work. There's a whole load of people who are going to be really, really annoyed because they're finally just got things actually now working in Databricks Connect, like remote development, working in their local IDEs, and then I'm going to go, oh, we can now just do it directly in the browser. But for me, most of my coding I still do in the browser, so that is going to make my life a hell of a lot easier. And yeah, we'll have a look at some of the new dev features as another video sometime soon as well. I mentioned when we talk about some the SQL functions, you've got these idea of foundational models or model providers. You've now got this idea of you've now got Google Cloud Vertex AI, one of the supported things inside model providers, so you can just build that inside as kind of one of your available models and then just use it inside Databricks really use that as a gateway, which is really, really cool. Jobs UI's had some changes to make it more in line for how Databricks Asset Bundles works. So if you've hopped on Asset Bundles, so you can more cleanly deploy sets of jobs and DLT pipelines and things between Databricks workspaces, then that's now going to actually make a little bit more sense. MLflow, you can now have quota limits. So with MLflow, when you're doing it previously, you just had a local model inside Databricks. It didn't really matter how many things you threw at it. It's just using your local compute. But now that MLflow is allowing you to run experiments on things like ChatGPT and put it through over to, kind of 3.5 turbo and stuff, well, that's going to cost you a little click. Every time you use it, you're paying for that. So you can now set up some kind of quota limit. So we're going to say, well, no, you can't just absolutely thrash this and cost us lots of money. There's now some quota limits for experiments and runs. Again, we can now do some more provisioned throughput with those foundational models. So we can pay to have, I want to have this actually so far working. That's now got GA, and it's also HIPAA compliant. So again, you can use it as if you're in a highly secure environment. Model serving, same again. So when we're hosting models and we're saying, well, this model's now live and we're hosted via Unity Catalog, that is now also HIPAA compliant. I can't say that. Finally, the last big change in March is this DBRX, which is essentially Databricks' own mixture of experts large language model. And there's been a huge amount out there recently. We definitely need to dig into that as a whole separate topic. You can now use that as part of foundational model API. So rather than having to do a separate sign up and go to and set up elsewise, it's just plugged into Databricks. You can now say, hey, I want to have DBRX set up here and use that as a ChatGPT style model. So if you want to be just using it as part of your code, throw a data frame out and do some, ask some questions of it. You want to basically build a little app using model serving and pass that into DBRX, you can do those kind of things. There's lots and lots of cool examples of what you can do, and it's surprisingly fast. The whole point of it, it performs the speed, the latency of how those queries work is crazy fast, and the accuracy is really comparable to the big, fancy, expensive enterprise flagship models. So really cool. Lots of stuff you can do in there. Main point here, it's now available as part of model serving. You can now just set up that as one of your foundational models APIs. Really cool. Final thing, new runtime 15.0. Now, as always, because it's a major version change, so we're going from the 14 series to the 15 series, there are breaking changes. So, breaking changes. 1, if you ever did select star and you wrap that star in brackets, why you would ever do that, I don't know. But if you ever did, Databricks would previously just ignore that. So it would just go, oh, they just meant select star. We'll bring it back as all of the straight columns. Now, if you do that, it assumes you want that to be a struct. It's going to pile it into a single column that has those various different attributes of your various different columns. So be careful if you use that syntax in any code anywhere, the behavior is going to change moving to Databricks runtime 15. Now, you need to be careful about passing in positional parameters into Spark SQL. It wants to be passed as the proper type. It needs to be a dict or a list. You can't just wang in something that it doesn't understand. That's now going to throw an error. Storing libraries in DBFS root is now deprecated. You cannot do that. If you were previously doing that and you haven't seen so many messages coming out saying you can't do that anymore, well, no, you definitely can't do it. You can't use runtime 15. The default Python version is going up. So if you have anything that's reliant on Python 3.10, that's now going to be moved. It's now 3.11. And there's a removal of JDK 11. So if you're doing anything with the Java developer kit, then you need to change that over into 17. Oh! So they're the breaking changes. So if you switch to 15, you're suddenly going to be hit by those ones. I don't think most people are going to be hit by it. Unless you're doing something really funky and it's been basically broken and you've not noticed for a long time, that should be fine. And if you were doing that, well, you kind of deserved it. Because that's just a weird thing to do. Bad SQL. Bad SQL. So yeah, we'll see. All right, so moving on, the new features that we got, there isn't huge amounts. You can now use a select star in a where. And I looked at this going, what? So you can now look at all columns in a where statement. The example being where 1 is in all columns in this given table. So we're checking essentially if any of these things is equal to this. We can now do that as a single statement. That's quite an elegant small bit of SQL. Check that any of these columns equal this value. We can now do that inside of our where statement using that star. Pretty cool. Weird, but I like it. Okay, we can now allow working out sort of awkward things without kicking out files. So a slight change of configuration, essentially saying it's okay if the struct doesn't have all the things that we've said, don't drop all the other fields. So column pruning should work a little bit better now. We can now use requirements.txt files. So if you want to spin up your clusters and go, just here's all the things to install when you spin up, you can now do that. The Databricks CLI is now available in the web terminal. It's great because the number of people who don't necessarily have Python stood up on their local machine because they've only been developing in the browser and they've only been doing those things. Or you've got a brand new laptop and you need to install a load of stuff to get the CLI working. Well, actually, if the stuff you want to do via the CLI, you can now just do it directly in the browser. You don't need to have anything installed locally, which is cool. I like it. Loads of quick use cases for doing things that we would do via the CLI currently. Means you can now do all secrets configuration through the browser, albeit through the CLI, but at least you don't need anything locally stood up. It's good. And you can now set up extra parameters to do with pip. So if you're trying to get it to go from a specific URL, if you're doing anything else, you can now actually set that stuff up on your cluster. So loads and loads of bits and pieces. Not crazy in terms of new functionality for the runtime, except for madness in terms of SQL, but it's setting things up ready. It's getting you with that latest version of with the version 3.11 of Python. It's getting things all ready with the latest version of redistributables. Essentially, they're cleaning house so they can do some more stuff further down the line. And yeah, no, I like it. I'm going to be writing where statements for stars in just for all the things now because you can. Yeah. Okay, so tons and tons and tons of things have been happening in the past 2 months. Loads of things require just their own videos. Tons of HIPAA compliant stuff going in. Loads of extra security and networking compliant, private endpoint links, the IP registry, all that stuff going in. Kind of crazy. Loads of new features such as XML support, as well as a bunch of other stuff. Improvements in SQL, parameterized SQL queries. Obviously, loads of stuff going on the Gen AI side of things, especially with DBRX, is a huge, huge thing that we need to dig into and talk about that stuff. Yeah, just lots of stuff going on right now. So, I appreciate this is the longest video in the world. Loads and loads of things. Do, as always, take a look through those release notes yourself. Don't just take my word for it as to what's important. Loads and loads of things in there. Do test all of your code before you upgrade to version 15, because there are some breaking changes in it. You need to be careful and make sure you don't break things. The whole point, right? Especially if you're going to turn on the automatic cluster update, because automatic cluster updates and breaking changes are an interesting party. So got to keep an eye on that stuff and make sure it all actually works out nicely for you. Tons of videos we need to do as a follow-up to loads of those pieces. As always, anything you guys want to see videos on, do let us know down in the comments. And yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe. Cheers all.